On a fog-swept street at dawn, Henry Carter drove his daughter, Astrid, through Windmere when he spotted a blonde woman in torn clothing pressed against a brick wall. She whispered, trembling, "Don't tell anyone you saw me." But Henry's heart already knew the truth. This was Audrey Lancaster, the CEO who had vanished amid a scandal drenched in blood. From that moment, he understood that if he drove away, neither he nor his daughter would ever be safe again. Who was hunting her? And why was a stranger like Henry the only person Audrey dared to trust? The town of Windmere clung to the northern coast, where fog rolled in thick as will every morning, blurring the line between sea and sky. It was a place where people kept to themselves, where the old cannery had been converted into artist studios, and where a single father could raise his child without too many questions. Henry Carter was 36 years old, a maintenance and refrigeration technician who worked out of a small wooden house beside his workshop. He lived simply, precisely, with the kind of order that comes from military training. Before Astrid was born, he had served in a technical unit, trained in survival protocols and non-lethal combat. He left that life behind when his wife died, choosing instead to give his daughter a normal childhood in a town where nobody knew what he used to be. Astrid Carter was 8 years old, sharp-eyed and curious, with a habit of carrying a Rubik's Cube everywhere she went. She could solve it in under 2 minutes, fingers flying across the colored squares while she hummed to herself. Between father and daughter existed a simple covenant. 3 things they never lied about: safety, truth, and kindness. It was the framework of their world. On the wall of Henry's workshop hung a tactical flashlight and an old CB radio, relics from his previous life that he had never quite been able to throw away. They would save lives before the story ended. Audrey Lancaster was 32 years old with wavy blonde hair and blue eyes that held both exhaustion and determination. She had been the youngest CEO of Lancaster Biotech, a rising star in pharmaceutical research until 2 years ago when she disappeared following rumors of embezzlement in a boating accident that left nobody. The official story was that she had stolen charitable funds and died at sea. The truth was far darker. Hidden inside the lining of her torn jacket was a thin, solid-state drive, no bigger than a credit card. It contained meeting footage and experimental logs that proved the conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of her former company. She had tried to bring it to journalists, but they had either been silenced or vanished from their profession entirely. Now she moved through the margins of the world, always looking over her shoulder, always one step ahead of the man who wanted her dead. Those men answered to Dante Grayson, the 40-year-old acting vice president of operations at Lancaster Biotech. He was tall and gaunt with pale skin and cold gray eyes, always dressed in a silver gray suit that made him look like something carved from stone. When Audrey disappeared, he had stepped smoothly into her role, closing ranks around the illegal trial program she had discovered. He employed contractors for his wet work. Men like Finn and Layan, who drove black SUVs and asked questions with their fists. There were others who would become important to this story. William Harris was a 52-year-old retired federal agent, a mentor from Henry's past who distrusted the media and believed only in evidence. Vivian Moore was a 33-year-old independent public relations specialist with a reputation for ethical work. A freelancer who had once handled crisis communications for Audrey, Alexander Pierce was a 35-year-old lawyer who specialized in protecting whistleblowers. Sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous when she believed in a cause. The setting mattered as much as the people. Windmere was all weathered wood and salt air, a place where morning fog turned familiar streets into gray labyrinths. There were abandoned boathouses along the shore, a pine forest at the edge of town, and a dark lake with a decaying warehouse on its northern bank. The town was small enough that strangers stood out, but large enough that you could disappear if you knew how. The dominant sound was always the ocean, a constant whisper beneath every conversation, every footstep, every breath. It was in this landscape that Henry Carter pulled his truck to the side of the road and stepped out into the fog. Astrid saw her first, a reflection in the side mirror. "Dad, there's a lady." The woman was crouched behind a low brick wall, her blonde hair matted and strewn with dirt. When she saw Henry approaching, she pressed herself flatter against the bricks, her eyes wide with something beyond ordinary fear. This was the terror of prey that knows the predator is close. "Don't come closer," she whispered. Then more urgently, "Don't tell anyone you saw me." Henry stopped 10 feet away, his hands visible and empty. "Who's hunting you?" She shook her head, a sharp jerking motion. "If you know, you and your daughter will be in danger." He had learned to read people during his years in service. And what he saw in this woman was not guilt or madness, but the clarity of someone who had seen too much truth. She was starving and exhausted, but her gaze remained focused, calculating distances and angles. Even as she trembled behind them, Astrid had climbed out of the truck. She was staring at the woman with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. "Are you okay?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "I've been better, sweetheart." Henry made a decision then, the kind that divides a life into before and after. He saw fresh mud on the woman's shoes that did not match the ground where she crouched. He noticed the security camera on the corner had been twisted to face away from this section of wall. And in the distance he heard the low rumble of a large engine, the kind that belonged to heavy vehicles prowling slowly through residential streets. "Come with me," he said. "There's an empty storage building next to my workshop. You'll be safe there. You don't understand what you're offering. Then explain it after you're somewhere warm." She hesitated, then nodded. Henry helped her to her feet, noting the way she flinched at sudden movements. When they reached the truck, Astrid whispered to her father, "She's really scared, Dad." "I know, sweetheart. That's why we're helping." The storage building had been used for boat equipment once back when Windmere's fishing industry was thriving. Now it was just dusty space and old tarps, but it had a roof and walls and a door that locked from the inside. Henry brought water and a clean jacket while Astrid appointed herself sentry, pressing her ear to the wall to listen for unusual sounds. It was a game to her, but Henry recognized the tactical value. His daughter had always been good at hearing things others missed. The woman drank the water slowly, methodically. She refused to give her name at first, but Henry saw the scar on her wrist, a surgical line that looked like it came from emergency trauma care. He had seen enough news coverage of the Lancaster boating accident to put the pieces together. "You don't have to tell me who you are," he said quietly. "But if we're going to help you stay hidden, I need to know what we're hiding you from." She studied him for a long moment, then reached into her jacket and pulled out a small object. It was a Rubik's Cube, but Astrid had slipped it into the woman's pocket without anyone noticing, a gesture of comfort from a child who understood fear, even if she did not understand its source. The woman's hand was shaking. Astrid saw it and said softly, "You can keep that, so you don't have to be scared." For the first time since they had found her, the woman smiled. It was small and fragile, but it was real. "Thank you." That night, Henry set up a rotation. He would check the perimeter every 2 hours. The woman was not to use any lights that could be seen from outside. No phone calls, no electronic signals. Astrid took her role as listener seriously, sitting cross-legged by the wall with her ear pressed to the wood, reporting on car engines and footsteps and seabirds. The covenant of safety was expanding. Whether Henry fully understood it yet or not, the black SUV arrived just after midnight. It moved slowly down the main street of Windmere. Its windows tinted so dark they looked like sheets of obsidian when it stopped in front of the closed newsstand. A man in a dark jacket stepped out and approached the elderly proprietor who was locking up for the night. "Have you seen a blonde woman? Maybe looking lost or scared?" The old man shook his head. "Nobody like that around here." The man in the dark jacket returned to the SUV. It continued its patrol, circling through residential streets like a shark, searching for blood in the water. Henry heard it before he saw it. He had been adjusting the CB radio in his workshop, the old military habit of monitoring frequencies that most civilians did not know existed. When he tuned to a specific bandwidth, he caught fragments of communication. Target sector, wooden pier, no visual confirmation. He switched off all the lights in his house and moved to the window. The SUV passed 2 blocks away, its headlights cutting through the fog like search beams. When it was gone, Henry returned to the storage building. "They're looking for you actively," he told the woman. "Not just watching, hunting." She closed her eyes. "I told you anyone who helps me becomes a target." Astrid was sitting in the corner with her Rubik's Cube, solving it and scrambling it and solving it again. A nervous habit. Why do they want to hurt you? The woman looked at the child, and something in her expression cracked. Because I know something they don't want anyone else to know. Henry knelt to Astrid's level. Go back to the house and lock the door. If you see headlights, use the code knock. After his daughter left, Henry sat across from the woman in the dim storage room. Outside, the fog pressed against the walls like a living thing. I don't need your whole story, he said. I just need to know if you want to live. She placed the small solid-state drive on the workbench between them. I want to, but if I live, I have to bring everything I know with me. Then we find a way to do both. The moment stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of the ocean and the creak of old wood settling. Finally, she spoke. My name is Audrey Lancaster. The corruption investigation that destroyed my company was a setup, a distraction from what was really happening. We were running unauthorized pharmaceutical trials. The subjects were orphans, children with no family to ask questions when they got sick or disappeared. I found the documentation, the meeting minutes, the consent forms that were forged. I tried to expose it, but they came for me first. They staged the boating accident. I've been hiding for 2 years. Henry absorbed this without visible reaction. He was thinking of his wife who had died in a hospital that used experimental treatments without proper disclosure. He was thinking of the doctors who would not meet his eyes when he asked questions. He was thinking of the way institutions closed ranks to protect themselves. What's on the drive? Video footage of executive meetings, experimental logs, test, subject identification numbers, everything needed to prove what they did. He reached out and touched the small device. It was cool and smooth, innocuous. It was also a death sentence for anyone who carried it. From this point, Henry said quietly, "We're in this together." Audrey looked afraid of that kindness. Your daughter, Astrid, understands the Carter principle. We don't turn our backs on the truth. The SUV returned the next night, and this time it stopped directly in front of Henry's house. Through the window, he watched a man in a dark jacket, the one called Finn, approach the front door. Henry moved quickly, accessing the workshop's compressed air system and releasing a controlled burst that created a localized fog bank thick as soup. At the same time, he grabbed the tactical flashlight from the wall and positioned himself at the back door. When Finn stepped onto the porch, Henry activated the flashlight strobe function, a disorienting pulse of light that filled the fog with chaos. In the confusion, he guided Audrey through the back exit into the abandoned boathouse that faced the water. They could hear Finn cursing as he stumbled on the porch, temporarily blinded. In the boathouse, Audrey was breathing hard, her hands shaking again. They'll keep coming. Let them, Henry said, but they'll have to work for it. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way he had been trained to think. They needed to get the information off the drive and create redundancies. They needed allies with legal authority, and they needed to stay alive long enough to make it matter. The next morning, Audrey told him everything. She described the executive meetings where Dante Grayson had calmly discussed phase, A7, and peripheral expenditures, corporate euphemisms for experiments on vulnerable children. She explained how she had initially thought it was legitimate research until she found the forged consent forms, the falsified medical histories, the test subjects identified only by number. When she confronted the board, they had turned on her with surgical precision, manufacturing evidence of embezzlement, planting false stories in the media, and finally staging her death. I kept copies of everything, she said. But paper trails can be destroyed. I needed video evidence, something they couldn't explain away. How did you get it? I broke into the executive conference room after hours and placed a wireless camera behind the smoke detector. I recorded 3 full meetings before they noticed and did a sweep. By then, I was already gone. Henry examined the solid-state drive under a magnifying lamp. It was commercially available hardware, nothing special, but what it contained was explosive. We need to make copies and distribute them to people who can't be silenced all at once. I tried that. The journalist I contacted disappeared. Then we don't go to journalists. We go to lawyers and federal agents, people with institutional protection. For the first time since Henry had found her, Audrey looked hopeful. You know people like that. One, his name is William Harris. He's retired FBI, paranoid as hell, and he owes me a favor from a long time ago. They began planning the next steps. First, they would create an encrypted backup of the drive and disguise it inside one of Henry's air conditioning units, a place no one would think to look. Second, they would contact William using a coded message transmitted over the CB radio frequency they had used years ago. Third, they would prepare for the possibility that everything would go wrong. That night, Astrid returned from school with mud on her shoes and a strange look on her face. "Dad, there was a man outside the school today. He asked me if I'd seen a lost lady." Henry felt ice crystallize in his chest. "What did you tell him?" I said, "No, but Dad." He was holding my Rubik's Cube. It fell out of my backpack. The message was clear. "We know about your daughter." An anonymous phone call came at 3 o'clock in the morning. The voice was electronically distorted. Robotic. "Leave the drive at the wooden pier. The child stays safe." Henry disconnected without responding. In the storage building, Audrey was staring at him with horror. "They're threatening Astrid because of me. They're threatening Astrid because they're desperate." Henry corrected. "Desperate people make mistakes." He activated the evacuation protocol he had designed years ago. A two-stage plan that would move Astrid to safe locations while he dealt with the threat. The first stage was the pine forest on the edge of town, where an old hunting cabin offered concealment. The second was the abandoned church 3 miles north, known only to a handful of locals. Astrid knew both locations and the routes to reach them. It was preparation that Henry had hoped never to use, but Audrey was not convinced. "I should turn myself in. If I go public, maybe they want you exposed. That's how they'll kill you and discredit the evidence at the same time." "Then what do we do?" Henry pulled out the CB radio and adjusted the frequency. He tapped out a code on the metal frame. 321, the old signal that we call in reinforcements. William Harris was a man who had seen too much corruption to trust easily. But he had also seen enough to recognize when someone was telling the truth. He agreed to meet at the ferry dock at dawn. But when Henry arrived, William was not alone. There was a surveillance team in a parked sedan. Government plates, but watching William like he was the target. The older man approached Henry carefully, slipping him a small object that looked like a key card. "Dead drop. Box 87 at the post office on Marsh Street. I'm being watched, so you'll have to move fast." "Who's watching you?" "Someone in my old agency is running interference. This goes deeper than local corruption." The key card opened a security box containing a single burner phone and a handwritten note. "Trust Alexander Pierce. She's clean. Get her the evidence." While Henry worked to make contact with a lawyer, Dante Grayson was making his own moves. He released a carefully crafted story to sympathetic media outlets. Audrey Lancaster had embezzled millions from a children's charity before faking her death. The narrative was designed to poison any future revelation, ensuring that if Audrey tried to go public, she would be dismissed as a criminal fabricating accusations to avoid prosecution. Finn, operating under the cover of a freelance journalist, approached Astrid School again. This time, he spoke with the principal, showing fake credentials and expressing concern about a woman harassing students. The principal, well-meaning but naive, promised to report any suspicious activity. The trap was tightening from multiple directions at once. Inside the storage building, Audrey was losing hope. "Maybe I should surrender. At least then your daughter would be safe." Henry faced her directly. "You told me not to tell anyone I saw you. But now I can't pretend I haven't seen justice. Justice is a luxury when they have all the power. Then we take the power back." He opened a laptop and inserted the solid-state drive. "Let's see what you've been carrying." The video files were devastating in their mundanity. There was no dramatic confession, no villain monologuing about evil plans. Instead, there were quarterly budget meetings where executives discussed trial phase optimization and peripheral cost containment. There was Dante Grayson's thin face on camera, his gray eyes flat and emotionless as he explained that Phase A7 subjects showed acceptable mortality rates for developmental compounds. There were spreadsheets listing identification numbers, none of which corresponded to actual names. The horror was in the bureaucratic language, the way human lives had been reduced to line items and efficiency metrics. "We need to get this to Alexandra Pierce immediately," Henry said, "but we can't send it directly. If they intercept it, they'll destroy the evidence and everyone who's seen it." Audrey had been thinking along the same lines. "We create a dead man switch, send the encrypted files to Alexandra with instructions. If she doesn't hear from us within 72 hours, she releases everything to federal authorities and the media simultaneously. And we use Windmere to coordinate the public release. She knows how to handle this kind of crisis communication." They were building a strategy of distributed risk, making it impossible for Dante to silence the evidence by eliminating any single person. It was sound planning, but it required time they might not have. The phone rang again. This time the voice was Dante's own smooth and cultured Henry Carter, former military maintenance technician, father of Astrid, age 8, who attends Windmere Elementary. "I know everything about you. Then you know I don't scare easily. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm offering you a choice. The drive or your daughter's future. I don't want to hurt a child, but I will if you force me to." Henry's voice was cold. "You've already hurt children. That's what this is about. Those were subjects, not children, and they served a greater purpose. You can tell that to a judge." Dante laughed, a sound like wind over broken glass. "There won't be a trial. There will be a quiet resolution, and you'll be remembered as a paranoid veteran who kidnapped a mentally ill woman and endangered his daughter with conspiracy theories." The line went dead. Henry looked at Audrey. "We're out of time. We move tonight." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Henry would send a false signal over the CB radio, claiming he was willing to exchange the drive at the abandoned warehouse on the north shore of the lake. The real drive would already be with Alexandra Pierce by then, encrypted and primed for release. Vivian Moore would have the press statement ready to distribute the moment federal authorities moved, and William Harris, despite being watched, would tip off his most trusted former colleagues about the location and timing. The warehouse was a trap, but the trap would spring both ways. As darkness fell, Henry prepared his equipment. He rigged the warehouse with reflective surfaces and angled lights, creating a disorienting maze of mirrors and shadows. He placed cable trip wires at ankle height, invisible in the dark, and he positioned the tactical flashlight at a strategic angle, ready to deploy maximum lumens at blinding intensity. Audrey insisted on coming with him. "This started because of me. I should be there when it ends. It's dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous, but I'm tired of hiding." They arrived at the warehouse an hour before the agreed time, moving through the pine forest that bordered the property. Astrid was safe with a trusted neighbor, given a cover story about a late work emergency. Henry hated lying to his daughter, but some lies protected what mattered most. Inside the warehouse, they waited in darkness. The lake outside was still, a black mirror reflecting nothing. Then they heard vehicles approaching, the low growl of heavy engines over rough roads. Dante arrived with Finn and Lan, 3 men in expensive clothing stepping into a building that smelled of rust and rotting wood. Dante's silver-gray suit looked surreal in the industrial decay, like a businessman who had wandered into someone else's nightmare. Audrey stepped into the light, wearing her torn jacket, her hand clutching the Rubik's Cube Astrid had given her. It was a signal, but to whom Henry did not yet know. "Dante," she said quietly. Audrey, his voice was almost fond. "You should have died at sea. It would have been cleaner. Cleaner for you." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "I'm going to give you one last chance. Give me the drive, and I'll let you disappear again. Refuse, and I'll have to clean up multiple loose ends tonight." She pulled out a small device from her pocket. The IT was the solid-state drive, but it was not the original. It was a decoy filled with corrupted data. "This is what you want." Dante gestured, and Leon moved forward to take it. But before he could reach Audrey, Henry released the cable trap, and Lan stumbled hard onto the concrete floor. Finn drew a weapon, but Henry activated the tactical flashlight, and the warehouse exploded into chaotic brilliance. The carefully positioned mirrors multiplied the light into a strobing hell. And in the confusion, Audrey shone her own light at an oblique angle, blinding Finn. Gunfire barked once, twice. Henry felt something hot grab his shoulder, but he was already moving. Using the industrial pillars as cover, He locked Finn's gun hand with a joint lock learned 2 decades ago, and the weapon clattered away. Dante had his own pistol out now, trained on Henry. Enough games. Drop the drives, both of them, or I shoot the veteran and then the whistleblower. That was when they heard the sirens. William Harris had made good on his promise, feeding information to agents who were not compromised. The raid was federal, coordinated, and overwhelming. Vehicles surrounded the warehouse. Floodlights turned night into day, and voices on megaphones demanded surrender. Dante's face went very still. He understood he had been outmaneuvered. You think this ends anything? I have lawyers. I have friends and agencies you've never heard of. Maybe, Henry said, but you don't have the evidence anymore. At that exact moment, Alexander Pierce was uploading the complete archive to a federal evidence server, time-stamped and encrypted. Vivian Moore was distributing the press release to every major outlet, complete with video clips and documentation. The dead man's switch had been activated, not by death, but by victory. Federal agents entered the warehouse and placed Dante Grayson, Finn, and Lane in custody. One of the agents, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, approached Henry. You're bleeding. It's not deep. You're also under investigation for kidnapping and obstruction. There's a lawyer named Alexandra Pierce who can explain everything. The agent studied him for a long moment, then nodded. William Harris vouched for you. Said you were one of the good ones. As they led Dante past her, Audrey spoke one last time. I hope the children you hurt haunt your dreams. Dante said nothing, his gray eyes finally showing something like fear. The media firestorm lasted for weeks. Lancaster biotech stock collapsed within hours of the revelations. Congressional hearings were announced. Criminal investigations expanded to include multiple executives and board members. The orphans who had been test subjects were located, and a victim compensation fund was established. Audrey Lancaster became both a villain and a hero in the public imagination, depending on who was telling the story, but the evidence was irrefutable. In Windmere, life slowly returned to normal, though normal looked different now. Henry's shoulder healed with minimal scarring. Astrid, who had been worried despite the careful explanations, hugged her father so tightly he could barely breathe, and Audrey, who had spent 2 years living in fear, finally allowed herself to rest. At the hospital, while doctors examined Henry's wound, Astrid presented Audrey with the Rubik's Cube again. You returned it, but I think it did its job as a lucky charm. Audrey held it carefully, as if it were made of something more precious than plastic. The luckiest thing was meeting you and your father. Henry, watching them, thought about all the ways a life could turn on a single decision if he had driven past that brick wall. If he had chosen safety over conscience, the world would still be ignorant of what had happened to those children. But he had stopped. He had listened. And in doing so, he had changed everything. You didn't save me because of who I am. Audrey said to him later when Astrid was occupied with a vending machine. I saved you because I knew what was right. Henry replied, that's the only reason that matters. 6 months later, Lancaster Biotech was restructured under federal oversight. Audrey Lancaster, cleared of all criminal charges, established an independent foundation dedicated to protecting test subjects and funding ethical research. She moved the foundation's headquarters to Windmere, a small coastal town where people still believed in the value of doing the right thing. Henry accepted a position as the foundation's facilities manager, a role that let him use his skills without drawing attention. He remained what he had always been, a man who fixed broken things and kept systems running. Astrid painted a sign that they hung in the workshop. No lies, only light. On a warm evening in late summer, the three of them walked across the wooden bridge that spanned the creek on the edge of town. The sun was setting, turning the water to honey and gold. Audrey carried a small object in her pocket, a key to the safe, where the original solid-state drive had been stored. The safe was empty now, the evidence having been transferred to federal custody. But she kept the key as a symbol. She handed it to Henry. I wanted you to have this. What is it? Proof that someone can be trusted completely. He turned the key over in his palm, feeling its weight. You're staying in Windmere. If that's all right with you and Astrid. Astrid, who was skipping ahead on the bridge, turned and grinned. More than all right, they walked together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. In Henry's workshop, the CB radio sat silent, no longer needed for emergency communications. The tactical flashlight hung on its peg, a tool that had saved lives and would perhaps never be needed again. The covenant that had begun with 3 principles, safety, truth, and kindness, had expanded to include one more person. In the quiet of the evening, with seabirds calling and the ocean whispering its endless rhythms, the silence was no longer something to fear. It had become peace. Henry looked at Audrey, this woman who had whispered, "Don't tell anyone you saw me and then learn to trust again. Do you want me to keep any more secrets for you?" She smiled, taking his hand as they followed Astrid across the bridge. "No. From now on, let the world know. We chose the truth." Behind them, the town of Windmere settled into twilight, a place where a single father and a missing CEO had found something neither expected. A family built on the foundation of doing what was right, even when it was dangerous. The story would be told for years to come about the man who stopped his truck in the fog and changed the course of justice. But for now, in this moment, there was only the warmth of connection and the knowledge that some things are worth the risk. The 3 of them walked into the gathering dusk,